Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly.
Broadcast from later, Valdis, Erica White, Uda Vera, our producer Serena Choi, and myself, Jeremy Glenn. I'm filling in for Robert Bolton today, so wish me luck. We are exchanging weak signals of change and trying to understand their significance. If you don't know, a weak signal is just a thing that we notice and don't fully understand yet, but we suspect may have a significant impact on our futures. As foresight strategists at From Later, we're steady tracking these signals and trying to make sense of what's changing. And on broadcasts like this one, we're giving a glimpse into what it looks like when you're trying to make sense of something that you don't really know anything about. The format is very much show and tell. A few of us bring in a weak signal and the rest of us try to make sense of it. Nobody on the team knows the signals in advance. So if you feel lost out there, you're watching, just join the club. We'll all try to make sense of the signals together. Joining us on our broadcast today is Gabriel Kahan. Gabriel is a writer and strategist, researching happiness, freedom, and justice in globalized digital economies. He's currently an incoming PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And Gabriel also helps to lead communications for AltCap, a community development financial institution, providing accessible capital to minority-owned small businesses and low-resource communities. Gabe enjoys sunshine, sketchbooks, and building low-grade websites, and has written many music reviews for sites like Ear Milk, Blah 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 Science, It's Psychedelic Baby, also a published poet. Welcome to the show, Gabriel.
Great to be here. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. I'm excited to get into some things, to do some spelunking with these weak signals. I love the format, and I love the attention to the speculative in the work that you guys are up to here. So I definitely feel like I'm with some kindred spirits at the moment.
Oh, amazing. Well, we're so happy to have you on the show today. Can you give us some idea of your background, how you got into strategy and some of your work in digital economies?
Yeah, I mean, professionally, I've worked as a freelance writer for a few years, and just kind of through osmosis started to learn a lot about different kinds of executive coaching, but then also got exposure to just the general philosophy that tends to operate in various organizational contexts, the priorities that executives have and how those compete with managers and how those compete with lower level workers. And that was just a whole hodgepodge of experiences that made me very interested in work as a contractor, as a strategist, as somebody who could work with people, take them through some kind of project. Usually it was writing, I've ghostwritten books, done a lot of articles, mentioned the music journalism, which was more of just for fun. But, a lot of those experiences were me helping somebody bring an idea to life. And the subject matter just ended up kind of becoming infectious. And it very much dovetailed with my undergrad experience, which was deep in the caverns of political philosophy, getting into economic justice, reading all kinds of old white German people. And I just started to connect a lot of dots between my experiences working with people who were in roles of leadership within organizations that were juggling a lot of competing priorities. And then I think just a long history of people that have brought a more critical perspective to the economy, and specifically kind of interrogated those same people in positions of leadership. And so now I kind of am arriving at this weird liminal space of being both interested in organizations and questions of economic justice that can scale, that aren't just local interventions, and then all of the weird interpersonal dynamics that either enable things like that to happen or don't. And that's kind of, it's married with just a general fascination with discussions around economic justice. And that, like you mentioned, is something that I'm hoping to study more with this PhD program. My elevator pitch when I was applying was that I'm interested in the future of labor, future of labor movements specifically. But I think at this point, I'm just very fascinated by the shifting definition of economic justice specifically, because I do think that there is some major shifts occurring right now. So I think one of the things I'd love to get into with my signal is just the current paradigm around what constitutes a healthy, functional economy, because of the environment, because of technology, because of just how we all are coming to define a happy life, that's not dominated by constant hustling and whatnot. So yeah, I'll pause there.
A born storyteller. That's very good. But I just wanted to ask, because we started this on the pre-show ramble, which was like, how did you start interacting with us? Like, where did you come across from later? Because we're actually like internet acquaintances, basically.
Yep.
So what do you want to go into your version of how we came across each other?
I guess I'll do a little plug for Arena because I just love it. And that was how me and Valdis connected. I want to say a year, maybe 2 years ago, I discovered Arena, which to me is like Tumblr 2.0 for professionals. Yeah, I just love like the audience that it tends to attract. And when I found it, I started putting together these boards of just the most like esoteric academic work that I had found entertaining or interesting in some way. A lot of things that I had studied in undergrad around like the CCRU, the University of Warwick, people like Nick Chernick and Alex Williams. A lot of those people I got really fascinated by, and I could see that there was some thinking on Arena in those spaces or with those kinds of ideas. So I can't remember who, now I don't know. I can't remember who reached out to who first, but I think we were both like, oh, you're up to some interesting stuff. Yeah.
It's funny. It's lost to the waves of like digital waste in the history on a channel like Arena. But I like the fact that it's like using Arena like a social network, just like coming across people and just being like, oh, what are you up to? And Arena has like a funny structure where, because they, I guess, disincentivize individuals. There's like ways that, like the fact that I can't remember following you as you remember it, like, but I've probably interacted with a bunch of your channels without realizing it now. And I'm like, I want to go back and try to remember, because everything's just kind of up for grabs in this weird kind of collective meld on that site. That's kind of what I find.
Yeah, it's to me, it's a site that's more about like making than it is about, like you're saying, like this log of interactions. It's more kind of like witnessing somebody's process in real time. I will say that I love Arena specifically for the transparency they seem to have with their organization. If you go to their about page, they have this really fascinating breakdown of like where the organization is, like where their capacity is, like the projects that are in the works. And I think they even have their finances up there, and like how their revenue model is, if it's succeeding, if it's not. And I just, as somebody interested in organizations and the intersection with them and economic justice, I find it to be an interesting case study.
I think at one point they were trying to turn it over to the community too. They were trying to like look at like an exit to community cooperative model where they would just like have like Arena users essentially become economic like shareholders in the organization. It's pretty
Isn't that what
interesting. I don't know where
happened
that
to some degree?
No, they sold shares when they first kind of launched, but I think at some point, but I don't know if they're structurally, I think structurally they're just like an LLC as far as I know. That could be wrong.
Yeah, I know they just have like a membership model, at least last time I checked. No, also very like, I've done a little bit of research with Trevor Scholes, and I'm also a big fan of platform co-ops and that whole model of doing things. So
cool. Yeah. Should we get started with signals?
Yeah, let's get into it. Valdis, what is your weakest signal?
Setting the bar really low for what a weak signal might be, I guess I always joke about, but I came across this digital humanities project called Orbis. And what it is, it's led by Walter Scheidel, who's like a historian at Stanford, and Elijah Meeks, who I'm actually not sure who that is. But I assume another kind of historian. And what they did was they made a kind of Google Maps version of what ancient Rome transport and trade networks were. And so you can go and use the site to try to get from different locations, like go from like Antioch to Rome to Carthage to Corinthia to Alexandria or whatever, up to London. Yeah, it just kind of covers mostly the Mediterranean, but it kind of allows you to like switch between there's all this like extra data included around like the cost of the transport, how many days it takes, like what changes based on the season, what mode of like overland transport do you want to take, like a donkey versus by foot. It's supposed to be a scholarly tool, not like a kind of I mean, it is public scholarship, but it's not meant to be like a, make history alive type of thing. It's meant to be used by scholars to some extent. As a signal, I don't know. Like, I'm curious, like what it means to overlay like layers of the past into the present. I don't know. Like, this doesn't seem like a signal to me, but I'm just curious to like have a discussion to see whether we can like jam a cube into a circle or whatever that phrase is, So yeah, it's Google Maps for Rome, basically, for the ancient Roman world.
What was the purpose? Like, were there like certain like insights or whatever that they drew from this exercise about like transport networks or supply chains, or like even kind of like meta about like the nature of like mapping and like, or anything like that? Do you know about this? Or
well, they're not like cartographers, so it's not, I don't think they're not interested in like the mapping side as much as I know like economic historians have been like reconstructing the cost of goods, because it's very hard to do that. I don't know, maybe some of you know better than I do, but like we don't have very good data on like what like beer used to cost or bread or whatever. And so like, because historians were usually like so focused on particular kinds of archives, they didn't do the work of like quantitative history or whatever as much. And so I think it's part of that wave of trying to do more quantified work on the past. For me, I find like I've been very interested in like stories of the past that tell stories of like transnational networks. And I know this is like way before the age of nations, so it's not like even kind of applicable in that sense to our like modern way of segmenting space. Something like the Roman Empire that stretches like effectively at its peak from like the interior of Central Asia, even India, to like London is like, it's so massive. I mean, there was like Chinese silks in Rome. There was like Roman, I think, pottery in Beijing, or what it would have been called then. So like the way that the Eurasian mass functioned as a kind of like conduit for people and ideas is part of what I find like so interesting, that there's always been like this flux and mobility across it.
Yeah, I want to know.
I deviated from your question.
Well, yeah, the first thing I was thinking of when you first started talking was like, oh yeah, I guess the Big Mac index only goes like 100 years. And like, to me, that's like what like I think about when I think about like as like a layperson, like what I think about when I think about like cost of goods over time, and like, how much things cost in kind of different spaces. And what's
a Roman Big Mac, you think?
That's what? Yeah, I was wondering what is like the garum, the garum index.
What's garum?
Oh, garum is like this like super popular Roman like ingredient that they used in cooking, which is like the pre-ingredient to like the precursor to like ketchup, like Worcester sauce, fish sauce, like all of these. Yeah, garum. It's like like you make it by like fermenting like fish in large barrels. It's like a very popular product in Rome.
I had a question, sorry, that deviates from that a little bit. It's not meant to really like zoom in on what the trade networks look like or how to access them or anything like a Google map. It's just to kind of show what was traded at any given point, what the fastest, cheapest, shortest route is. But it doesn't actually zoom in on any of the like infrastructure or give any kind of like snapshots of what's going on at like when you can zoom in on Google, it doesn't have that capacity. It's just kind of like mapping it at a macro level rather than.
It is like the roads and the like ocean routes or sea routes, and the cost of them is shown. It is like Google Maps in the sense that you do enter like locations, and it shows you the map, or it shows you the route rather. And then you can zoom into all sorts of like information about that route and what would have been going on it. So if that's how you meant it, it's not just like a static map.
Yeah, I guess it's when you mentioned just how information layers itself from like in the past to the present, there would be like a lot more details on a trade route that you wouldn't normally get from a Google map just off the surface. And I always like when there's like these mapping projects that kind of come out and give that extra layer of detail that's perhaps a little more granular in terms of something specific. And in this case, it's like goods.
I love that they have donkey as a mode of transportation that you can check. Donkey, wagon, passenger, and carriage.
I guess that's what confused me too. It's like it seemed like the modes and like the things that they're tracking, it's like it is ancient. It's rooted in a certain time.
Yeah, it's certainly fascinating. I don't know if I see it going anywhere.
How could this disrupt the future?
Were there like paths that were possibly surprisingly much faster to like travel through than people would expect? For example, like there could be like weird kind of like edge cases, right? Like where there are trade routes that are sometimes just longer, that just take longer because of like national boundaries and like regulation, or like having to like move through territorial borders in a certain way because of like diplomatic relations and things like that. And I wonder if there are like certain routes in this map that are just like were way faster to travel through back then than they are now. And like if that like provides some insight about like how we could arrange our like supply chains. But I don't know, I'm just trying to like find grasp on something about like what could be like useful about this.
Yeah, like a compare and contrast of like what was then, if it was actually efficient versus the efficiencies that are sought out today.
Yeah, exactly.
Or like just a reflection of contemporary like geopolitics and how it disrupts certain supply chains or makes things like grossly inefficient that maybe they didn't have to deal with back then. Or maybe they had their own difficulties, their own inefficiencies for the same reason.
Is this like Waze for the supply chain?
Exactly. It's interesting to think about like, and maybe on a more meta level, like how something like Google Maps, which is proprietary and was made privately by a company for the company's aims, and how that then gets like appropriated for public aims or I don't know, just appropriated by like people outside of that context. It's reminding me too of like when everything first started with Ukraine and people were looking at like the flight maps as like that like open source intelligence. I find it both like eerie and fascinating how people appropriate in that way.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, Bratton makes this point that like all of these functions that used to be carried out by states, like mapping, providing identity documents, certain forms, like certain kinds of currencies, are now being provided by these kind of platform actors instead of state actors. That's kind of what that makes me think of.
Yeah. 100%.
And the convergence of like, or inversion of their functions in some way.
I don't, does it actually use Google Maps? I don't think it does.
No, this doesn't. Yeah.
I mean, there are like open source mapping projects. Open Maps is like one. The flight radar stuff is like, to me, is like super interesting because that is also actually, that's not a private company. That's also like some dude's like hobby project. And where he realized that you could actually like take a software defined radio, which you can just buy off the shelf, like, and use it to like listen to air traffic control. And then if you had enough of like a network of people, like amateur, radio enthusiasts who were like listening to these, you could, with that information, triangulate and get information about plane locations. And he used that to produce Flight Radar 24, which is like not at all like it's like almost like a public project. Like it's just like some dude who started with his friends. But since then, there's like a couple of different like projects in the same vein that have started. Another one is there's another one that tracks lightning strikes along the same principle, because it disrupts sort of like the electromagnetic spectrum a little bit. Then you have a lightning strike, and you can catch that also on a radio. And if you have 3 of those also, at different distances, you can triangulate like the exact location of a lightning strike. And some folks have like started like a lightning tracking network, which is like this beautiful like open source community project. And they're all kind of doing it as like a public, like almost as like a public good. I don't know. To me, those projects are like really fascinating and exciting as like kind of like the dream of the internet. Like when I first got excited about the internet, common space, peer production.
The idea of like having access to old trade networks to some degree seems like it could be like a public relations exercise or like a community building exercise to be like, look, we used to be on the same trade route. And, you know, if you could have like walked this particular route, you could have like been in our town. Like I was reading this book called Destiny Disrupted, which is about the history of the Muslim Empire. And they were talking about how so many like towns got established basically around crossroads between different trade routes. And if enough people were crossing these trade routes, they'd just be like, well, let's just set up a stall so we can start like trading goods in this particular spot. And I think it's so cool to be able to like reference some old map that people used to use as a way to understand how to get from one place to another, but like could now be seen as like, oh, these were like relationships that we used to have, you know, between our, now they're nation states maybe, but previously they could have just been particular towns or like, you know, that kind of thing.
It used to be friends.
Yeah, what happened?
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is that like the people in the places aren't the same either. These things change over time. This idea of like the power of geography has become like quite big in like Russia in a controversial way. So there's been this like effort to try to rethink like what a Eurasian, quote unquote, Eurasian civilization would be like. This is, I don't know if I want to talk about this, but it's been this like kind of underground current on the part of like these philosopher type geopolitical figures inside of Russia. And some people think it's quite influential in shaping how they go about sort of what's going on right now in Ukraine, which is basically to say that they see the Eurasian landmass as a kind of like coherent whole that needs to be like linked up and all the trade routes like established on it against the kind of quote unquote Atlanticist bloc, which was like the US and the UK and their use of like the oceans and whatnot. And so this turned to like China, Central Asia, etc., to try to kind of like weave it all together. Yeah, it just made me think of like the way that history gets mobilized in geopolitical projects that shape the future. That's basically what I'm getting at. You know? And I don't know what it means in this case because I haven't looked into it enough. But, you know, these are Americans doing this. I don't know what it means for them. But is American foreign policy like visible? You know, futures of American foreign policy, is that visible in this project in any way? You know,
you have to look into the map lobby.
The map lobby.
You know, Rome is such an off-sided metaphor at the moment. I think especially in the like American political landscape. I know you guys are in Toronto, but yeah, it seems to be that we are a failing empire. I don't know.
Signal or noise? Gabe, do you want to go first? Do you think it's signal or noise?
I don't even know what the "it" is in that sentence. Is the map, the idea of the map, or the map itself? I guess it's Valdis. It sounded like it was like the notion of grafting the past onto like current technologies or current like knowledge production. In which case, I would say sounds really cool. But that's been going on for a while. So noise.
It's totally cool to say noise. Totally fine. I know there's a lot
Sorry
of
to harsh your vibe.
No, it's cool. A lot of residents. I don't even think Valdis was sure whether it was a signal or not. Uda, signal or noise?
Signals don't exist.
I think it's noise. I don't really know what it's a signal for. And yeah, if the signal is just digital humanities, and that's been happening for a while, I guess.
Okay, Erica, signal or noise?
I think it's somewhat of a signal just because I find that you do have a lot of these like commons type mapping projects that are highly specific and outside of Google mapping, the Google Map sphere popping up. The one that also came to mind while we were chatting was during the pandemic. I guess like when the supply chain of like food and toilet paper was super heavy and like high, people started making their own mappings of like supply chains. And I just think that's so crazy to, you know, when a group of people are like, okay, we're going to take control of the supply chain, we're going to take it into our own hands. And this is more historically developed in terms of, the compare and contrast of what occurred then and then is happening now with digital mapping projects and just how things were done then and how things are done now. So I find it interesting, and on the one hand, and then also a signal because of just these like highly specific mapping projects that are popping up.
Yeah, I could see that too. I could definitely see it as maybe a signal of, some attempt at increased understanding of like where we came from, maybe like past relationships. I also think there is something to what Gabe was saying about like the fall of the American empire, let's put that in air quotes, and maybe trying to get a better understanding of other empires and their relationship to each other and their sort of major cities and that kind of thing. So I'm going to go signal on this one.
I just want to chime in. I know we usually don't do it that way, but I brought this in not having like an idea if there's like anything there. But I agree with what you just said, where I think, Gabe, your take on like the parallel to like Rome, which was also like at the birth of the American project. It was self-consciously an effort to like recreate like Roman political structures, Republican political structures. And now it's in this phase of like, seeing all these parallels to decline and trying to figure out how to like avoid that, and going into the past maybe is part of that like tale of figuring out what to do next. I mean, it's definitely like, what is America's role as like a global hegemon? Like it's very much like shifting, and what that will look like in 10 years is quite up in the air, I think. So it's kind of interesting to see that in that light. So I appreciate the discussion because it got me to see some hope in this as a signal. Actually,
I do want to interject because I really appreciated Erica's comment just now. It reminded me that maybe it is a signal. So maybe I'm gonna redact my former vote. It's actually really interesting. I interned for Verite, which I know you mentioned when you first reached out to me. They're like a international labor rights organization, and the project that I was helping them on was all around the buzz that the supply chain world is currently dealing with around traceability, specifically like implementing the Internet of Things, geocoding, QR codes, like those kinds of technologies, some blockchain too, but specifically to map supply chains. So in a very literal sense, I think it is a signal. Like people are really into that.
I think people are just like afraid of like the collapse and like want to make sure that they have their things, you know?
I mean, I will say what I learned from that experience is that it's just so difficult for so many reasons.
Yeah, I didn't want to take the combo there, but I was going to say that supply chains are like obscure on purpose. That's like their whole function is to be not traceable so that they can be rearranged like very efficiently.
So many incentives to not trace them.
Awesome. Gabe, are you good to go next?
Sure. Yeah.
Gabe, what is your weakest signal?
Yeah, so there's an article in the New York Times, an op-ed that came out recently that was kind of diagnosing the American workplace and the various feelings that are arising from the various strata of workers. And I'm happy to like get into that with you guys, but I think I want to focus on the notion of post-work, especially because it seems really interesting to me. It seems like a pretty viable way of redefining how we think about economic justice. For clarity, the way I am thinking about post-work is a departure from the previous paradigm around what like a healthy, vibrant economy looks like. The traditional one we all know is just the notion that a healthy economy translates to good quality jobs, to good benefits, a union job, well-paid, safe workplace, that kind of thing. But that like the ultimate goal should be like full employment across the board. And post-work posits basically the assumption that maybe the better scenario is less work altogether and a less work dominated culture, forms of identity, that kind of thing. Yeah. So this has been an interest of mine for a while, and I know it's not very new in many ways. Like I want to say this goes back at least to the 70s, if not before that. There's the sociologist Stanley Aronowitz, who's written about post-work in the context of labor movements and how, I mean, there's a direct tie from this to the 8-hour movement in I want to say the 1880s, where we got the current workday. And then up into people like David Graeber talking about things like bullshit jobs, and just the realization that massive swaths of the economy are devoted to work that we can see as busy work or tedious or just wasteful or even predatory. And then there's more contemporary people like Nick Cernikic and Helen Hester and Alex Williams, who I mentioned earlier, and they're writing about things like UBI. They're also working with Autonomy, this think tank in the UK that is trying to institutionalize things like the 4-day work week, both publicly and privately. So it's an ongoing discourse, but I guess my weak signal for it all is I feel like it's gaining some more momentum, particularly in the context of the pandemic and everything that has unleashed. And I'm particularly fascinated by it in the context of what people have described as the Great Resignation, and how people have interpreted the abundance of jobs and nobody wants to work and everything's falling apart. I think that it's a really interesting context. There's also the r/anti-work Reddit community that has been popping off in the last couple of years. I think they're at 2 million subscribers now. They've been doing some interesting stuff, but it's also that's another thing that's is that a signal, or is that just a bunch of angry people on the internet? It's hard to tell. So yeah, that's my weak signal is post-work becoming more of a thing.
The Great Resignation comment is really funny because there was a meme the other week that referenced it, and I was like, oh my God, that term sounds so outdated, even though it was only a year ago that people were talking about it. But partly because the Fed is trying to raise rates explicitly to lower employment because that's how they think they'll tamp down on inflation. So whereas a year ago, all the op-ed heads were running around being like, oh my God, the Great Resignation, we can't get enough people to work. Now all of the op-ed guys are just oh no, we got to raise rates to get people out of the market so that inflation tampers down. It's completely schizophrenic in how they feel about how much work is needed in a society.
They're raising interest rates to lower employment figures.
Yeah, it's explicitly being called for and kind of talked about. Larry Summers is very explicit about it. He's not, he's an advisor. He's not as far as I understand, he's not actually working there. But
yeah, there's an economics term, I forget what it is, but for the sort of ideal unemployed, the ideal unemployment
it's the
rate.
Phillips curve.
The Phillips curve, that's it. Yeah. In the back of my head, I always kind of assumed that increase in interest rates would actually lead to more people wanting to work because, there's less access to sort of cheap money around, which is, in my opinion, the reason why a lot of people were able to kind of take some time off and, just relax. I don't know.
Well, it induces a recession. So that's going to lower employment just on its own. But yes, it's true. It also reduces rentier type people who lived off of assets that were just inflating in value that didn't have to work for a living. So it's true. It does kind of both things to some extent.
Well, the great thing about this op-ed in the New York Times was, I think, how this woman was problematizing that whole narrative of all of the service sector. I don't know, the Starbucks and the Taco Bell with the help wanted signs, and how it was just everybody had spontaneously arrived at some kind of class consciousness and were leaving in droves. I felt she did a really great job of breaking down how a lot of people just literally can't because they're sick or they're dealing with childcare or they've moved in with family. There are other people primarily in the more white collar industries that are developing some level of class consciousness, but the two are having very different experiences, and to connect them all and to create this unified narrative of the working class rebelling across every level of employment is a little bit, I don't know, you miss some pretty crucial details there.
The same way everything's framed as generations, so it's the same way of obscuring maybe the different dynamics going on. The differentials like within generations are more important than across them.
Yeah. I mean, I'm hopeful. I really am, like, especially with Starbucks, everything that's been going on there. Yeah, I don't know. I see that a large portion of the service sector are people with a certain level of education, and I think exposes them to those kinds of ideas of economic justice. But I also at the same time see that, like, I know I've read trends about like just the US economy in general moving to, there are a lot of like economies in the global north moving to more service oriented economy. So it becomes increasingly more significant if that's the sector that's developing this kind of organizing.
Interesting. I mean, the 4-day work week is definitely, a conversation that has become more, I mean, I've noticed it being a lot more pronounced post-pandemic, if you can call the current moment post-pandemic. But yeah, it seems like a lot more people that I've encountered have been talking about 4-day work weeks and have been trialing it. It feels like the UBI conversation has kind of tapered off, though. I don't know if that's like a prominent conversation in the States anymore, but in Canada, I don't know if you know this, but in Ontario, actually, there was a UBI pilot a couple of years ago, but it was actually canceled during the change in government when we used to have the Liberals in power, and then we switched to Conservatives, and the UBI pilot was unfortunately canceled. But since then, at least in Canada, that put a bit of a damper on the UBI conversation. But I don't know what it is like in the US. Actually, I'm curious.
I mean, yeah, I can't speak for all of us here, but I've been pleasantly surprised by some of the headlines I've seen. I know that there's a coalition of mayors, I want to say, across the states campaigning for it. And every once in a while, I'll see something that really like blows me away, in spite of just the intense chaos that is like the electoral system. I'll hear about like, I know in Maryland right now, they just piloted like giving, I don't know, I want to say like 800 families that meet certain like income eligibility, like something like $500 a month, no strings attached. And it was like a huge success. And like, I see those and I just like scratch my head, like, how is this happening at the same time that like all of the other garbage fires are happening? So I wonder what the context is there. But I mean, it seems to be present.
Is the elephant in the room that like there was effectively a nationwide UBI experiment during COVID,
cash
right?
transfer.
That's what it was, right? It was like,
yeah,
pretty close to whatever the floor is for what people were suggesting for UBIs. It's funny because like the first thing I thought of, I was like, well, with all the talk about like inflation happening right now, it's like no wonder UBI is going to be maybe or might be dead in the water in some way, even though it maybe isn't necessarily so easy to correlate the two and blame everything on like government handouts and whatever. But it'll be like, it's an easy link for people who are against it to make, right? And so to mobilize the claim that UBI would like lead to just inflation and whatever.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't have the training to respond technically to that, but one thing that comes to mind is just like balancing calls for UBI with calls for some kind of redistribution. Like those things have to be happening simultaneously. Like people have to be paying their taxes as much as we are providing certain kinds of like stimulus, like you're saying, you know what I mean? Because I mean, I don't know the economics of UBI specifically, and I know that it's been refuted that those kinds of things do lead to inflation. But it seems like a helpful piece of the conversation that we get into, like more specifically, like how do we redistribute the wealth that we currently have, as opposed to just printing more.
100%. I think the argument is essentially the people that would benefit the most from UBI will put the money into circulation much faster. So it'll increase the sort of velocity of money, because people who need the money will spend it, which is overall just increases the productive capacity of an economy. The other argument against UBI is often that there's certain like social supports that you cannot do without. So one justification for UBI is actually, by reducing the sort of like bureaucratic overhead of like delivering social services to people, you can like redirect that capital to unconditional cash transfers to people. But the counter argument for that is often that, there's certain social services that you actually need to provide to people, right? And cash just doesn't do it. healthcare being one.
I wanted to bring up the way anti-work or post-work has a kind of like revulsion factor for a lot of people. Like there's this kind of, it's like the word degrowth. It just causes people to react in a particular way, right? Because it's like, oh, what do you mean like a post-work society? You mean like a lazy, like don't do anything type of society? Like
nobody wants to work.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
as President Kim K would say.
President Kim K. Like it's clearly like I think they call degrowth like a missile concept for that function it has. Like it kind of just like polarizes any room that it's launched into, and it's kind of like, it's interesting. I don't know where people are launching. I guess it's in the op-ed of New York Times where people are launching that like missile word into, and for what reason, but those are the questions I have. Yeah.
I was just going to say, to be clear, I'm associating post-work with the op-ed. She didn't use it. She was mainly talking about this shift towards anti-ambition, or people like being less interested in like ladder climbing and more so interested in different kinds of solidarity, or just opting out of the rat race altogether. But no, I completely agree. And oftentimes when I bring up this notion of post-work to people, I like very quickly will segue into like tangible real world examples of UBI, or the idea that post-work emphasizes that it's not about the abolition of work, it's about less work. And that there is a really, I think, beautiful, fruitful conversation to be had about what should be automated and what shouldn't be automated, what's undesirable to be automated. Kate Soper, amazing British philosopher, wrote the Verso book on post-growth, really emphasizes, especially when it comes to care work, there's a lot that would be beneficial to not be automated, that we would enjoy these things, and that it's, she argues that it's part of what makes us human, and I would agree. So yeah, but it's a slippery slope to these kind of fully automated luxury gay space communism to I think a more real world example of, we're not spending 40 hours a week, 5 days a week doing something that probably isn't too meaningful.
Yeah, I was going to ask like what the sort of psychology aspect of it was, because part of what I'm reading around the 4-day work week is like there's the problem is not so much the way we're allocating the time, it's that we're allocating too much work within the allotted period of time. Like it's not like how do you divide your week up better? It's the fact that we're expected to do more than we should probably be expected to do, that we're maybe putting too much on our plates, and we're saying, well, the culture is like, well, in work, we should be expected to be working all the time, or that's part of like the deal when you join the workforce, is like sometimes you have to work at overtime and do these extra things. And I feel like so much of what that pushback against the 5-day work week is like, there's this expectation that you're going to strip that day away and all of a sudden your life is going to be so much better. But I still feel as though there's a strong expectation to be completing a certain amount of work. And maybe that's more of the issue, is that we're putting too much on our plates as far as work is concerned in the first place, or we're putting too much emphasis on the import of that work. And we really shouldn't be trying to do that much heavy lifting all at once.
I feel like that requires such a huge cultural shift, because like realistically, the problem is like there's no single company that could kind of like get away with doing something like, hey, we just like lower productivity by 70%, by like 30%, and assume that's like given like the type of like competitive business culture that we have, right? Like maybe if you had a different business culture that was more like, sorry for going this direction, but like cooperatively minded or something like that, there would be like, like you could probably get away with that, where like, like a federation of co-ops could like self kind of contain and like hold each other kind of accountable to norms. Or you need like regulation to like hold people to kind of like tie your hands, right? And without that, I just don't see like a shift happen in that way.
I will say that, yeah, I just think that the Great Resignation does signify like some zeitgeist of like exhaustion of our current state of work and the things that we're tied to. But I'm not exactly sure if it gets to the crux of the things that we need as a community or a society in terms of the kinds of work we value, or the kinds of pleasures and things that people want to get into.
Yeah, can we just swap casual Fridays for like candy striper Fridays or something like that? And like just take the day off to do something productive in the community as opposed to spending it on increasing shareholder value.
You know where they did have that, Jeremy? They had these things called subotnik in the USSR, where on Saturdays you would go work for the community.
Of course they did.
I wanted to split up like the different, like there's different like elements of like whatever this post-work trend is that like maybe are helpful to separate. There's like the automated version or something, like this idea that somehow technology is making it possible to do away with X amount of hours that we wouldn't have had to do before. And I think that's like effectively been possible throughout much of the 20th century, you know, and Keynes was predicting it in the 20s and whatnot.
Yeah.
There's also like this idea of like, oh, is it some kind of a value shift or a cultural shift, which to me can be a little vague or something. Like I don't find the Great Resignation a useful heuristic, like a term. I think that's how we open the convo too, of like kind of being like, well, it collapses a whole bunch of different motivations and experiences and contradictions and tensions into like one kind of vague like idea that like a value is just shifting, which a lot of like futurists love this idea that like the future is going to be shaped just because suddenly people will realize and they have a new set of values and they'll go about just changing how the world is because of those values. And it's like, I don't know, it seems a little naive or something to me, like that version. And then there's like a version that's kind of like redefining and exploring what we mean by work, which I think is really interesting, which is kind of like, yeah, why do we do the things we do? Like, you know, like what really is incentivizing versions of the rat race and whatnot? What is, you know, these like concrete mechanisms like debt, like the fact that people take on so much debt forces them to work in circumstances that are like so, and in ways that are so probably like unfulfilling. I mean, for some, maybe for others, it's quite exciting to kind of work at the edge of debt, you know, like, yeah, in fact, there's a lot of people who love that thrill of edging default or something. Yeah, those questions. I was just trying to split up like these different like takes on it because it's kind of like post-work buckets all of them together, you know?
Yeah, I just saw this. Rob just sent me this comedian making this joke about like people being afraid of the robots taking over. And he's like, wasn't that the point, that we'd give all the work to the robots? Like, shouldn't we be happy now that the robots can take over? In those automated examples, that's the point. Wasn't that the point? There's better things to do than to do these simplistic, you know, automated jobs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Signal or noise, everyone. Udit, you want to start off?
Yeah, I don't think it's like a weak signal, but I think it is definitely a signal, maybe even a strong signal in at least the conversations that I've been having in the last year with people about, you know, wanting to like reevaluating their work lives, and people I know who kind of like lead organizations seriously considering how to restructure their organizations to give more time back to their employees and things like that. I mean, I think it requires like serious structural shifts in our economy to make it happen. But the only way that it's going to happen is like people bringing it up and talking about it. So, which is what I think is happening right now. So I would say it's a signal, a strong signal.
Valdis?
I don't have anything smart to say. I think it's like, I think I agree with Udit. Like I see it, yeah, part of a wave of discussions around work. I mean, even the fact that like the future of work is like, or was at least for a long time, like there's just so many conferences on it inside of commercial spaces. And this is like different because this is kind of like a more political, more like subcultural part of those conversations, and even like kind of a fringe part of it, like the lineage of like anti-work thinking or post-work thinking is quite a fringe of a fringe of a fringe, and in that it's quite interesting. But there are popular versions of it, yeah, like the Graeber, you know, tale that of bullshit jobs that's like circulated so much. I think it's a signal in that like I don't know what it leads to, like, and if that's what makes it a signal, then yeah, I think it's kind of like it's really hard to imagine what a culture that doesn't value the kind of like psychology of loyalty or devotion to work would look like. And I mean, I don't think that means there's no discipline. If anything, maybe there's like much better forms of self-discipline in a future like that, in a post-work future, you know, self-imposed disciplines. There's a lot of like openness to it, I guess. So yeah, signal.
Cool. Erica, signal or noise?
What work is at any given point in time is always changing, and perhaps in some cases it hasn't, and there's like very long-standing traditions that are in place. But modeling something like, I don't know if someone already mentioned like donut economics or the care economy or like universal basic everything, those kind of models I think do start a conversation about what people value and what should be commodified or not commodified. And I get excited about those. So I think it's a noisy signal because there's a lot going on in it, but I think it's a noisy signal overall.
Well, yeah, I agree with a lot of what everyone's saying here. I think like I brought up the psychology aspect because that's what's most interesting to me, but specifically like, yeah, what are we valuing if we're not valuing like work, or we're not placing that value in terms of like our manual labor or even whatever mental labor, and just reevaluating this whole process of what it is that we do. I definitely think it's a signal. Erica, what is your weakest signal?
My signal is about fake socialites. And basically, this student from the Central Academy of Fine Arts recorded her whole experience over the course of something like 21 days, where she was living free in Beijing as a socialite. And so basically that just meant she was like dressed up, she posed as a socialite, slept in lobbies and used all these public facilities. She dined really lavishly. She said it wasn't about wealth inequality, but it was more so about living off of society's excess. And it got a bit of traction and it's been met with some like criticisms. Yeah, I guess some people are just like, oh, this is a prank or a loophole for you to get free food and and to lounge in first class sections at the airport. But I thought it emphasized how much of society is a commercialized space, and that there is excess in those spaces versus like a public space. So yeah, that is the signal.
Fakes.
Interesting. So just so I understand, it was like this person who's like basically like living for free off of these sort of like luxury spaces, like first class lounges and so on. And then the access that she got to the spaces was basically through her pretending to be a socialite.
Yeah.
Okay.
So she like got all dressed up. She would use like very lavish public spaces to get ready or to sleep. Like I think in one case she was like sleeping in a lobby, and she just mentioned to someone that she was waiting outside to see if her husband was like cheating on her. So they just let her sleep. The examples are really funny. Or like somehow like was able to sleep in an IKEA. Like there's just certain instances where she just received like a lot of free things from, and so she would say based off of the way she looked and was presenting herself. And so
like, was it for a purpose? Was it like performance art, or was she just like this was just what she was doing?
She said it was a social experiment. So
Social experiment.
Yeah,
Okay.
social experiment. This like student from, I guess, the Central Academy of Fine Arts recorded everything and shared it, I guess, at the end of her program. And so
This is like Anna Delvey, but performance art or social experiment, whatever you want to call it.
I was gonna say there is something about just like this like swath of like fake heiresses that are being jailed for elitist scams. I was gonna bring that up too.
Was she ever forcibly removed from any of these places, or like how many instances, like, or did she just game the system full on and like nobody gave her any problems?
She said that she was asked once out of the whole 21 days. She was asked once what she was doing, and I think in this case, she's just said that she had left the hotel, and so she was able to still get access to the hotel because she said that she just had checked out. So I think she was only asked once out of the whole 21 days.
Interesting.
You know, there's like a whole subreddit called, I don't know if any of you have seen this, called Act Like You Belong, which is like people basically like playing confidence games, like get into like places that they have no business getting into.
Have you done it? Have you tried it? No, you can't publicly talk about it.
If I'm dressed okay, I will use like hotel washrooms if I'm out and about. There's a hotel nearby, even if I can't afford to eat or use that hotel. Otherwise,
The first rule of being a fake socialite is you don't talk about being a fake socialite.
I mean, it's a great commentary. I don't know about a signal. I'm not sure if everyone's going to go out and start doing this, but it's a great commentary just in the sense of like, yeah, access to spaces, how you present. It makes me think about this concept a friend shared with me. I think that's popular in like urban design around the third space, and how like in many like cities and urban areas, there's like the notion of the first space and the second space being your home and like just everything commercial, and the third space kind of being this like hope for something public, something where nothing is really required of you. There's no transaction. It's not commodified. And it seems like, I mean, there's clearly a third space for people who can afford it or who have that social capital.
But also in an IKEA, like she was able to like sleep in an IKEA, which is obviously
Okay,
like
yeah.
a luxury space.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was like she slept for a little second or what have you, but there's just all these clips of her using not public, commercial spaces to live. And I guess, yeah, she got some criticism over the commentary being less about, I guess social welfare and more about just living off excess. But I do enjoy like when a art school social experiment pops up like this, and I don't know if it's necessarily impactful. And there's points of it where I do think it might be a bit contradictory, but yeah, it does feel like a signal of how commodities reflect like every aspect of social life.
Mm-hmm. I feel like it's a signal of this, that people just can't be bothered. Like they're just like, you want to use the lobby? You know what? Fine. Like I don't get paid enough to have you, to like try to kick you out of this hotel. And maybe that
just
does
trust.
Say something. Yeah. Or like a power dynamic or something like that, right? That's like, that is just like, well, you look the part, so we're not going to mess with you.
Yeah. There's a bit of like confronting like her objectification and the messy realm of influence that she like wields in a commercial space, I guess, where she can get a bunch of free things, I guess. But I was really intrigued by just that she was able to fulfill like more than basic needs. And there was like a bit of like a resistance to marketization, I guess.
I mean, you're framing it like it's like a freeganism thing. That's what I think of, It's like she's like dumpster diving for services, right? Like effectively. And like whatever's like thrown out that's just kind of excess, she can kind of like get a hold of, and, no one's the worse for the wear. I watched a lecture with Frank Abagnale or whatever, the guy who was like inspiration for Catch Me If You Can last night. So anyway, so I watched it last night. So it's it's a strange thing bringing up this example, because he did this in the 60s, and he like did the same kind of, or very similar kinds of things. Like it wasn't a public stunt, which makes your version like raised to an aesthetic level of like, it's like an art object or whatever. But he had the same kind of like, everything was just improv. It was like nothing was planned. You just figured out as you went. And it was like, oh, you saw that like people were going there. Like, what would happen if I went there? And then like, what would happen if I pretended that, I was like a pilot and nobody like questioned me, and finding all these like ways that there was like excesses in the society. But the one thing he brought up that was interesting was that in regards to like contemporary life, was he was asked like, oh, was it just like easier to do back then? And he's like, no, it's like way easier today. Like getting a fake ID, pretending to be somebody else, recreating like creating a ghost profile of yourself or whatever, or just stealing somebody else's identification. The way that you go about making like ID cards and all of these things is like way easier than it was back then. So maybe there's a lot more of these fakes out among us than we realize, or something like that.
That's what I was going to say, because when you said freeganism, it immediately made me think of all these people like 10 years ago that I knew that were like taking freight trains around the country and like dumpster diving and just like living among whoever as a way just to be like, yeah, well, there's enough out there that we can all access it. We don't need to pay for it. We just need to get the access. and it's totally available. And that's what it makes me think of too, is like, maybe there are lots of people doing this and like you wouldn't know, because the sort of cultural way in which we interact at like a service level, where you're not asking a lot of questions of somebody who looks the part. They come up, they look like they know what they're doing, they act like they know what they're doing, and it's not your job or place to say something about it. Seems very easy for somebody to pull off, I think, these days.
There's even like a whole slew of businesses that support that kind of posturing. Like in Miami, like renting a really expensive like sports car is like very easy and common for people to just like blow an afternoon in a Lambo and like just pretend that they're rich and see what they can get into and whatever, you know?
It's like a Ponzi scheme with social capital instead of like actual capital, where you're like, you're using borrowed social capital to get access to more social capital, which you can trade for more social capital to like climb the social ladder.
And it just
and then who's left holding the bag?
Like, yeah.
It's like in The Office where, is it Dwight, where he like tries to trade his way from like a paperclip to some like to like a telescope.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was the other thing that it reminded me of, was the whole trade up situation. Yeah, you just end up in a room of Rothschilds at some point and they're all like, no, you're not supposed to be here.
It is making me think of just like you were, Erica, framing it as like a kind of taking advantage of excess, but I was also thinking of just taking advantage of trust, like I was saying a moment ago, and like how we like to think that there are all kinds of regulations and policies and rules that like make our society cohesive. But at the end of the day, like so much of it just comes down to trust and people essentially profiling other people and just making a kind of, split-second decision based on a serious approximation.
All the like signals of trust, right? Like all the things that kind of signal trust and that there is trust, which often are also like symbols of class, in this case at least, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting.
Part of the thing is that those things are not like, they're specifically not meant to be, they're meant to be like quite subtle and like you're excluded without realizing how you're excluded, like you grow up with the wrong accent, or you don't know what a fork does at like a dinner service, or like the thread count on your suit is just like slightly noticeably off, or whatever it is, right? Like there's these cues that go in. One of the things that I've heard people say is that like the more you try to pretend to be hyper rich, like at first you try to be really well put together, and then you realize just the more crazy and out there you are, the more people believe that you're actually like some billionaire, because you like, yeah, it's like there's like a horseshoe factor once you get to the very top, on your way up, you have to like pretend to be more and more put together, but once you're at the top, it's all the rules are gone.
The uncanny valley for billionaires.
Yeah, I guess
approach.
The like Kanye aesthetic. Yeah.
Something else that came up in the article was that there's just been talk of like the government in China planning to implement a new tax for high income influencers, because an influencer can I guess there's just more tax offenses happening in entertainment. And so there's just this wider conversation of like, how much do influencers and these folks who kind of are, I guess, seen as socialites making. And I guess the government in China is like talking about putting like a different tax on these kind of folks, which is also interesting in terms of controlling a specific part of the entertainment industry.
What do you feel like this potentially signals, Erica?
I guess just that there's this like messy realm of influence, and that I think it was actually quite impressive that she's able to over 21 days live for free off of commercial spaces. I thought that was just very compelling, and that like there are these basic needs filled. 21 days, I don't know if that's necessarily a long time, but there was some success, I guess, that she found in it. So I would say that's the signals, the living off excess commercial spaces.
Should we go around and see what everybody else thinks? Gabe, do you want to say signal or noise?
I like the way you summarize it, because I do think that there's like dumpster diving, and I hadn't heard of freeganism before. I like that. I think there is some kind of general movement to just like politicize waste and form communities around it. Housing comes to mind, and just the sheer amount of waste that occurs there. So in I guess in that context, like I would say there's some kind of signal, maybe some like to come full circle back to what I was bringing up, like some kind of post-growth signal, like repurposing industrial waste. I don't know, but yeah, sure. I'll say yes, signal.
Post-industrial waste.
Yeah.
Valdis, signal or noise?
I like the term I just used, but post-industrial waste seems like a kind of funny, interesting, I don't really know what it means, concept. I don't even know if post-industrialism is like a coherent concept, but because there's like so much industrial activity that supports post-industrialism. I like the interpretation put on it, Erica, like the kind of Freegan approach. I think it's interesting. I probably would say that I've like Freeganism seems obviously to like be what it is and will be what it is and always has been what it is, you know, like I'm pretty sure if we go back to like ancient Rome, we'll find Freegans, you know, before they were called that. And we'll find them in whatever other like economic system we put together in the future. So I don't see it as like a shift of, I mean, by definition, it can't spread beyond its niche, right? It's like defined by being an edge case. There's probably like discussions around work that seem interesting. We didn't make those links, but there's probably stuff there. Like, what does it mean? Like when your identity is your work, you know, today, like, or a lot of your work is like managing your social identity. There's stuff in that seems interesting to me, but I'm not sure what it signals. So I'll just say noise in the end for that reason, for those reasons, even though I like it.
Ude?
I still like the original like Anna Delvey angle, which is like, I mean, I think there's like a fascination of like with people who have gotten away with being somebody who they're not, and in sort of like more and more complex ways using the tools of our time, and like we've in some ways like revealed like the like hypocrisies in our culture and things like that. I mean, I don't think that's like necessarily new, but it's interesting to think about like why those stories are like coming up right now, and like why do we have such a fascination with them. And it's seeming like there is a lot of like wealth inequality and a type of class consciousness that is like leading to people being interested in these stories, right? And so maybe it's a signal of that. It's just like it's like a manifestation of like the type of class consciousness that people are experiencing right now.
So signal.
Signal, yeah.
Signal. Cool. I mean, I feel as though there is a strong degree of like celebrity or like luxury kind of fascination to this story. Like it's kind of like the person that's doing it is definitely exposing some inequalities, but I feel like that maybe like why it's interesting to people, or because we've always hoped to like, it's kind of part of this gamification type of signal, like it's nice to get one over on the rich guy, be able to like take advantage of the things that they might take for granted. So in that respect, I see it as sort of noise, but yeah, potentially a signal of people being more interested in that kind of thing. But I think overall I'm gonna say noise in terms of the celebrity aspect. Broadcast from later.